I'm going to take a look at another classic chess game. This one's spectacular. It's known as the Immortal Game, and it was played between Adolf Anderssen and Kieseritzky in 1851 in London. Anderssen had the white pieces, and the opening was a king's gambit. Back in those days, if white offered a gambit pawn in the opening, black was obliged to accept it, otherwise he was branded a coward. So black accepts the gambit, and Anderssen played bishop c4. A more popular move in this position is knight f3 to keep black from giving a check here on h4. But Anderssen allows that check. He plays bishop c4, and Kieseritzky calls check, and Anderssen steps aside. Notice there's no better move here. For example, you can't block with your pawn because the f-pawn would take, and you can't recapture or the rook in the corner would get taken. So you have to move your king, and the best square is on f1. So this doesn't look great at first when you look at this position. The white rook is trapped in the corner. We've spoiled our castling rights, but white's going to get a counterattack with knight f3 hitting the queen, making the queen move again, and his pieces will unravel, and white argues that black is wasting time moving his queen around. Okay, so after king f1, Kieseritzky plays a very strange looking gambit, counter gambit, b5, hitting the bishop here, and the point of this move is to draw the bishop off of this powerful diagonal, and Anderssen accepts the counter gambit, and so black has drawn that bishop off of the powerful diagonal and opened up another square for his bishop to develop. That's not such a popular move nowadays. In fact, it's almost never played. Along the same lines, but an improvement, is the move d5 in this position. And the point is to draw the bishop forward to d5 and then attack it with your knight, okay, and kind of get a tempo here on the bishop. Also, if white takes with the pawn, then he's blocked his own bishop along that diagonal, and black can play bishop d6 to fix that pawn on d5. Okay, so that's a better attempt, I think. But Kieseritzky liked this move, b5. It was a specialty of his, and Anderssen accepts the counter gambit. And then Kieseritzky takes the opportunity to develop the king side and attack this pawn on e4. Okay, before defending it, Anderssen attacks the queen, which falls back to h6. Good square, keeps an eye on this f4 pawn. And then Anderssen protects the pawn with d3, opening his bishop to attack the f4 pawn. Okay, after d3, Kieseritzky plays a questionable move. He puts his knight on the edge of the board away from the center, and it's kind of a cheapo. What black is threatening here is to move knight to g3, forking the rook and the king. For example, if white makes a non-move, just to illustrate, check, and white cannot capture the knight without losing his rook in the corner. Okay, so white has to do something about this, and he plays knight h4. So now the move knight g3 no longer works because the knight is blocking the queen's access to the rook in the corner. A better way to deal with this, though, has been suggested by annotators, rook g1. Okay, that takes the rook off of the h file so it can't be taken. And the point of that is to expand with the move g4 later on and have that rook protecting the g4 pawn. Okay, but Anderssen plays knight h4, and he had to do a lot of analysis to make sure that move was okay, because black played queen g5, forking the minor pieces. Anderssen makes the only move that saves them both, knight f5, okay, blocking the queen's access to that bishop. Now, black responds by hitting the bishop on b5, But let's take a look at what would happen if black tries to kick the knight away so that the queen can take the bishop over here. Well, after kicking the knight away, white has, or after playing g6 here, white has a surprising save in the position. He can play h4, hitting the queen, and the queen would either drop back to d8 and then allow the knight to move away. Oops. Or the queen would move to f6. And the point of that is the queen has left protection of his own knight on h5. So if black ever decides to take this knight, the pawn will no longer be protecting the h5 knight, and white will get a knight back. In fact, it's kind of funny here in this position that white has no moves with his knight. He can't move it anywhere safe. The queen has d4 guarded, but he would just continue his development, because if black ever takes, white will take that knight, and white will be in the driver's seat. Okay, so it's quite a complicated game. There's a lot of analysis that's been done over the years. Black played c6 in this position, and white didn't want to take the time to retreat his bishop. He wanted to play aggressively, so he counterattacks the black knight. Okay, the black knight moved to f6, the only safe square. Some have remarked a better move was g6 to counterattack again, and then everything is hanging in the position. It's quite complicated. Turns out to be a pretty equal position though. g6 gives another square for the knight to retreat to. One of the problems with Kieseritzky's move, knight f6, is it blocks this diagonal, this retreat diagonal for his queen, and it makes his queen kind of vulnerable here to being trapped. Okay, in fact, after knight f6, which hits this pawn on g4, white ignored the threat on his bishop and just played rook to g1 to protect the g4 pawn. And then black took the bait, took the bishop on b5. He saw that his queen wasn't being trapped. White played h4. The only safe square is queen g6. White pushed the pawn again, and the queen's forced back to g5. Okay, now white does attempt to trap the queen with the move queen to f3. So he's hitting this pawn, and he's threatening bishop takes f4, and the queen would have nowhere to go. So black has to do something about that. He needs to generate an escape square for his queen. And the only way to generate an escape square is to move his knight. But the knight has nowhere to go except back, and that's what black played. So black won the bishop on b5, but look at his position. He has 7 pieces on their original squares on the back rank. Okay, so that's terrible. White's got much better development. Could black have done something else in this position? Well, it's kind of funny. If you put this into the engine, it suggests the move bishop b7, just developing. Well, how does that help? Don't we just lose our queen here? Well, the point is black can counterattack with knight takes g4, because if white takes the queen, then black has this nice fork. King comes up, takes the queen, takes the knight, and if you look at the board, the material's actually equal. White won his piece back. But white's got much better development and has a strong position. So either way you play this, black's not doing so good in this position after taking that bishop on b5. So he played the miserable knight to g8. Oops, not in that position. In this position, he played knight to g8, and then white took on f4, and the queen retreated to f6 here, which does attack the b2 pawn, which then would be attacking the rook in the corner if it gets taken. So white protects the b2 pawn by developing his knight to c3, And then after developing his knight to c3, black plays bishop to c5, hitting the rook here on g8, developing. He's got to try to get developed quickly here. Now, since white has such a lead in development, and he's got some aggressively placed pieces here, he should look for ways to attack. And he found really a spectacular way to attack with the move knight to d5, hitting the queen so black doesn't have time to take the rook. But that did allow black to take the pawn on b2, and now black is threatening both rooks. However, white has seen ahead and realized, hey, I don't need my rooks. I've got these 4 strong pieces that are going to take care of your king. Okay. So after queen takes b2, white leaves both rooks hanging and plays this spectacular move, bishop to d6. Okay. And the point of this move is to take away this retreat square from the king. There are going to be some mating attacks coming, and this bishop is going to participate. But it's a very bold move because not only is white hanging his rooks, he's hanging the a1 rook with check. Okay. So what should black do in this position? Well, black decided to take the rook on g1 first. Okay. He can't take this bishop, by the way. White would have a mate in 4. He'd have check, and then either the king goes here and gets mated with queen takes f7, or goes here, and then check, goes back, check, goes back, and mate. Okay, so the bishop was immune when it moved to d6. Okay, so black had to do something else after bishop d6, and he played bishop takes the rook on g1. Now, black could have actually survived this position and even gotten to equality according to the engine by actually playing queen takes the rook on a1 with check. But then after king to e2, he should not take the other rook with either piece. The only way to survive is to play queen to b2 in this position. The point is black needs this queen on this diagonal to protect the pawn on g7 because of the check. Knight takes g7 check, okay, with a mating attack. Okay. Also, he's indirectly protecting his bishop on c5. The best line for white is to take it, and then black would fork the king and the bishop. And then black can barely hang on in that position even though he has no development of his pieces. Okay, he's got enough of a material advantage and he would hang on. Okay, but that's not how the game went. Okay, he didn't take the a1 rook. Kieseritzky took the g1 rook. And then white plays another spectacular move. He wants to play knight takes g7, check, but the queen's guarding that square. So he plays e5, okay, blocking the queen's protection of that square. Then black took the other rook, probably reasoning, I'll call check and think about it later. Okay, so after that move, white steps out of check, and white is threatening 2 different checkmates in this position. Let me illustrate one of them. If black makes some non-move here, one of the checkmates is knight takes g7 check, king can't go anywhere but d8, and then bishop to c7 is mate, okay, guarded by the knight. So that's one of the checkmates threatened, made possible by this move e5 so that we can take on g7. But there's a more spectacular second checkmate that white is threatening that Kieseritzky missed. Okay, Kieseritzky saw the basic checkmate starting with knight takes g7, king to d8, bishop to c7 mate. And he protected against it by playing knight to a6 to guard that mate on the c7 square. but he did not see Anderssen's brilliant second mate in this position. Okay, which is knight takes g7 check, king to d8, and now we can't play mate here because the knight has that protected. By the way, we can't play mate here either because the other knight has that square protected. But Anderssen played queen to f6 check, sacking his queen. It's the only legal move in this position is to capture the queen, and then mated here because the knight left protection. So it's a spectacular finish here. White sacrificed everything, both rooks, a queen, a minor piece, and he finished black off with just 3 minor pieces, and that's why this game is called the Immortal Game. I want to point out that black could have lasted a little longer by playing the move bishop to a6 instead of the move knight to a6. The point of bishop to a6 is to create another escape square here for his king. So if we tried the same checkmate like this, it doesn't work because of the move king to c8. Okay. However, white's attack would rage on in this position, and black would still eventually lose. All right, thanks for watching this spectacular game. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.